Shining bright lotus. Shining bright lotus.
Thank you. Nice to see you all here today. I think we're gonna, there we go. And I'm gonna, sort of try and wrap together the 6 talks today. Hold on, I want to change my view back because I like seeing the gallery view. And in a way, it's like awakening and emotional maturity. Well, the Mondo process and the Mondo facilitation is awakening and emotional maturity. It's kind of like it says it right in the title. These are 2 separate things, but then what Jun Po wants to do, or what Jun Po's work was to put the 2 together. I think that's the novelty of his teachings, using the koan process. So I want to sort of roll the whole process back to the beginning, because there's a lot of sort of assumptions that arrive in Mondo Zen that I think are worth unpacking. And I think that comes from the habit of Zen liking to skip all that stuff. So, we love to talk about the origins of Zen, of Bodhidharma coming to China and sort of basically saying no merit and no self, and then staring at a wall for 9 years. And we forget that he was talking to an audience that was very, very, very up to date on their Zen Abhidharma, so to speak. So we have a habit of skipping this stuff. So I want to start at the very beginning. The very beginning is the Four Noble Truths. Four Noble Truths. The first truth is life is suffering, dukkha. Now, last time I checked, that notion of suffering is an emotional experience. It's pointing at an emotions right there. Okay, so it's like in the Buddha's basic structure, he's including emotions, but we do know about 2,500 years ago, we didn't really know as much about the way the mind works as we learned in the 20th century. So most of the literature doesn't really distinguish between thoughts and feelings. They all get put together as thoughts, or the 6th mono, which is what's happening in the mind. The 5 senses and the mind is the 6th. But we now in modern times recognize that thoughts and feelings are even different parts of our brains are involved. So we start with this dukkha, life and suffering, and then of course the second noble truth is samudaya, which is that suffering comes from craving or attachment. Right, we can say desire, aversion. My dear wife Hakui, who's on this call, we were just commenting just yesterday that I think it's pretty much a function of life that all living forms have either a move toward or move away from reflex. Right, like, oh, that's good. Oh, that's not. Okay, so that's kind of the second noble truth, is that suffering of the first comes from our craving and attachment, which leads to the third truth, which is there is a cessation of attachment of this suffering. There's a way out of this suffering. That, I mean, in the traditional language, it's naroda. Okay, but the point is that's the foundations of the Buddhist way, that we can actually do something that's going to relieve us from being in this cycle, which is the 4th path, which is magga or marga, depending on whether you use the Pali or the Sanskrit, and that's the Eightfold Path. That's the way. How do we do this? So that's where we start, and of course, so the whole Mondo Zen facilitation is based on this whole idea that there's a way out of this suffering, and you can use awakening to somehow do something a bit more than just be empty. in some way. So the next thing that comes up in Jun Po, that informs Jun Po's teachings, are the 3 marks of existence. Okay, and that shows up in the introduction of the Mondo manual, which is anicca. I'll use the Pali, which is impermanence. Which, if you pause for a second and just close your eyes and just notice your breath. You can get a quick dose of anicca, impermanence. The breath arises and falls and changes kind of quickly, instantly. Everything is changing. So the second of the 3 marks of existence is dukkha, which is interesting because that's the same dukkha, suffering, from the 4 Noble Truths. And then the 3rd mark of existence is anatta, or anatman, depending on which language you're using. And that's no self. Okay, so no self is, we get kind of caught up in a certain kind of notion that that's just how we translate it, or the self is empty. And it's not saying that we don't have a personality, we don't have a being, we don't have a sense, but that when you look inside, there's nothing concrete that I can find inside of me. So let's try that little activity here for a second. So close your eyes again. Settle your breath. Now let's just sort of kind of say your name in your head. There's a notion of self. Now look for where you might find that self. Look in your body. Can you find yourself in your body? How about in your thoughts? Is yourself your thoughts? Or your feelings? So as we look, we don't really find anything, but there is something doing the looking. Yeah? Right? The looker, the witness. Right? So there is a being that each of us are, but there's no concrete self. Okay, that's the anatta, right? And now that becomes really important, because in that awakening process and in the Mondo facilitation and in the first 2 lectures that we did, which was Ango's and then Kogan's lecture, it's like, who are you? That's what we're pointing at. We want to have that experience of not knowing, not being able to find ourselves. Right? And that becomes a really important piece in the emotional maturity, because we need to be able to access that particular experience of no concrete self. So let's do that one more time, right? I'm going to ring the bell, right? Just because it's kind of a fun thing. The Mondo has a lot of bell ringing in it. Right? And I want you to just look, who am I? Look for who you are. Actually spend the process looking for who I am, who you are. And as you're looking, you may not find anything, but there's an experience of something, which has been Jun Po called clear, deep heart mind. That's the experience that we start to notice when we quiet the thinking, feeling mind, but we're able to be with that no self that we all are arising out of, which is why the third koan is actually who are you, who am I, who are we at this level of awareness. So it's a little bit more than who am I, it's can I have the experience of the emptiness from which all of these, everything is arising out of. So I would imagine that most people here on this call have this experience. Right? That's something that we're a pre-sorted group of people who have all been doing this for a while. So that makes it a little easier. Okay? So Jun Po studied the classical koans. Okay? And so this particular this koan that we're pointing at actually points directly at the first koan in the Mumon, which you guys at this stage all know as Joshu's koan, which is, does a dog have Buddha nature? And Joshu or Zhaozhou says moo or woo or no, which is the translation, right? No, right? No to the question, no to the thinking. It's not that there's no Buddha nature, it's that there's no thinking, there's no conversation, there's no intellectual process necessary for one to be with this realization. Okay, so it's very similar to not knowing. Who am I? Who are you? That's the same Buddha nature in some way or another. So that's the original classical koan. So the classical koans come from the 9th century, right? This is the Mumon, which is a book that I'm very familiar with. I always have an affinity toward it because it's written by a guy named Ekai. And so I kind of felt an affinity for the Mumon and started reading it over and over and over and over again. And so, interestingly, awakening is this process of getting in touch with it. And you can fast forward all the way to later when I think Fujin Roshi talked about this in his talk, the remember and choose koan, right? Does this come and go and remember and choose, right? Because it's here all the time. So what happens? I get in the way. I stop noticing it. Okay, so awakening becomes an ongoing process of bringing this realization into our life. And the 10 steps that we've covered, and actually, in these stages, takes us through that process of developing the muscles of integrating the awakening experience in such a way that we can begin to live by it. That's when we get to the emotional maturity part. Okay, now Daiden did a wonderful job at taking us through the koan 11 and 12 and the actual, the power of the original teachings. Okay, what I want to do is I'm going to sort of slightly unpack it slightly differently and go right to the 13th koan. So one of the key pieces that we're pointing at, what Jun Po's pointing at, is the second koan in the Mumon, which is actually the wild fox. And if you're not familiar with the wild fox, it's a really long koan. And I'm not going to read you the whole thing, but it's really about a guy who shows up at a monastery, and he turns out he's been reborn as a fox for a long time because he answered the question. He didn't answer the question the way he needed a question, so he ended up having to have a lot of fox karma. I'll let you think about what fox karma looks like. But the koan ends up, the huato of the koan is, are greatly cultivated people subject to causality. Are greatly cultivated people, or just are people subject to causality. And the master, right, which is Baizhang, says they are not blind to causality. Okay, they are not blind. So as opposed to no, you have not blind. No to thoughts arising, not blind to what's arising. And now we start to have more of a middle way. You have the absolute realization of the awakening process where everything shunyata is empty and there's nothing happening. We're all just floating around in this emptiness with no attachments to anything. And meanwhile, we're all walking around having to make dinner and figure out what to do with our kids and the elections and all the other things that we have to figure out what to do with. And so that's causality. And if we just say, it's all cool, we're not really using ourselves skillfully yet. So that's the relative world, the not blind. And so then you get the middle way, where you include both the awakening and the not blind relative world. That's where the emotional maturity comes in, okay? Because that's one of the main ways as an organism we respond to the universe is through our emotional responses. Okay, it's pretty instinctual. It's midbrain. Okay, so one of the ways we can listen to what's happening, not without an opinion, it's listening to what our organism's telling us. We're not blind to that stuff that comes up. It's also called what we're triggered by. Okay, because that seems to be what comes up, right? My guess is you all know what I'm talking about. So Jun Po in the emotional koan work focused on anger, shame, and that particular cluster, okay, and dissociation, right, disconnection, and we've done a little bit of homework, some of us at at Shining Bright Lotus, and we've kind of really recognized that we can build out the whole emotional section. We're using Carla McLaren's The Language of Emotion, which of course I got from Integral Zen, because I use that as one of the seminal texts over there too. I'm sure that died and you probably use it in your Sangha as well. And so then, just to be really clear, those emotional responses come in 4 buckets. Okay, there's the anger family. Anger, apathy, boredom, shame, guilt. Those are what Jun Po focused on. There's the fear bucket, which is fear, anxiety, worry, confusion, jealousy, loneliness, envy, panic. There's the sadness family, which is sadness, grief, situational depression, and suicidal urges. And there's the happiness family, which is we always forget that one. We seem to think that one's okay, but you can cling to that one too, which is happiness, contentment, and joy. Now, of course, the happiness, contentment, and joy is one of the things that come up in the meditative states if you look at the 7 factors of awakening. But those are slightly different than the emotional midbrain. I really like gambling on college basketball, so I'm going to keep at it. It's a different joy, so to speak. Okay, right? So those are the big families, and so Jun Po in his wisdom liked to, and you've all heard this, that feelings is just like another senses, and we need to get the information. Right? Okay. And so what is becoming clear is that response that's coming from the organ, I'm angry, or I'm afraid, or I'm sad, or I'm depressed, or I'm full of envy, is, and Emil gave a great talk about whether envy is, how highly functional envy and jealousy really are in ours. They're giving us information that part of the emotional maturity is not to bypass that, but to get that in there. And so then what happens is Jun Po used koans as his technology. Okay, so the actual koan that you have heard, I'm going to use the koan, the 13th koan from the book, which is, from Kogan's book. The 13th koan is, and I'm not asking you to do it quite yet, but we will get to doing it, is visualize yourself transforming a habitual negative reaction into a conscious, compassionate response. Right? That visualize yourself transforming a habitual negative reaction into a conscious, compassionate response. All right? That's what the koan is. Okay? And then, it's been through a lot of iterations. Okay? But for a long time, it was stop and drop. Anyone familiar with the stop and drop? The idea being, I guess Fujin appreciated that, the idea being that, recall a triggered experience, drop into clear, deep heart mind, right? And then from here, I can have a compassionate response, right? That's the basic tenet. What I'd like to suggest is that we can slow that way down, which is something that Jun Po liked to say, slow it way down, right? And actually there might be more to this, and that's what I'd like to actually do with us right now. Okay, so we all get to do this a little bit, right? And you can see how we can just make the emotional koan as a technology if just a little bit of adaptation becomes a more robust process. Okay? So, I'm going to use the bell. You guys know about this bell, right? I'm going to start by asking you to actually just settle into clear, deep heart mind so that we're coming from that particular place. Here we go. You can do this with your eyes open or closed, whatever you prefer. Allow yourself just to settle into the bell. And I want you to find yourself again. So lighten up a little bit and find that notion of self and do that activity. Go looking. Can you find a concrete self? Where are you? Are you in your legs, in your chest, in your head, in your thoughts? But there is a watcher. There is someone who's listening and doing this process. So now I want you to actually, from this self, just pick some sort of emotion that you want to work with tonight, some sort of feeling, something, common. It doesn't have to be a rocket science like, childhood trauma. I want you to actually allow yourself to welcome the feeling into your body and notice your body's response to the feeling. Can you think of a situation at some point in your life where something happened and this feeling arose? Run that story for 15 seconds, a brief. And as you do that, notice the somatic sensory response. So we're welcoming the feeling and we're attuning to it. So attuning is becoming aware of the sensations. We're getting a clear sense of the feeling. And you can even, from the mind perspective, kind of look at it a little bit. Now, just like what you did before when you looked to see if there was a you, is there a you in that feeling? Is that feeling concrete, or is that feeling too empty? It's just another expression of clear, deep heart mind. Okay, you can release the feeling and allow yourself just to drop into clear, deep heart mind again. And it's a sentence stem. If I allow myself not to be identified with this feeling, I feel blank. Fill in the blank. Just repeat that. If I allow myself not to be identified with this feeling. And notice what that is like in your body. Does that allow you to become more still, empty, silent? It doesn't have to, but for many it does, particularly if you've been doing this for a while, right? So I think in Jun Po's language, I would call that releasing the contraction, right? Rather than releasing the contraction, I allow myself not to be identified with it, with this feeling. Right? That's okay. Let's try the opposite. This is where you get the information. So still, I hope you can all hold on to that feeling. Let's find that feeling again. Try this sentence stem. I need to be identified with this feeling because. Repeat that and just see how your mind fills that up. I need to be identified with this feeling because. What story comes up? That's the information in the feeling. Okay? But we're not done. I need to be identified. Well, let's release the contraction again. If I'm allowing myself not to be identified. If pure awareness is not identified with this feeling, I feel. Just let yourself just drop completely into the stillness. Pure awareness is not identified with this feeling. I am. I feel. Okay, so from here, we just go back to the top, right? So, does this feeling serve a function? How do I show up for this feeling with what I know, right? We're going to take, we could take a minute or two to share, but I'm going to wrap and then we'll talk about it for a second. So the emotional koan process, as we become more and more familiar with it, is, if we slow it down, is to spend more time welcoming the feeling in, okay? Really welcome it somatically and attune to it, okay? Then, right, we have the opportunity to release the contraction. I don't have to be identified with it. And I need to take a moment to say, how come I am identified with it? How is it serving me? And listen for the function. Listen to what that feeling has to say, right? And then from there, I can now release again into the emptiness. Is that making sense for folks in some way? We'll have a chance to ask questions about it. I think, we would spend more. I'd like to hear people report out. Well, we'll do that in a second. So let's just kind of wrap this whole thing up. So with Jun Po's teaching, awakening becomes the ability to learn to not be identified with a concrete self, right? That comes through concentration and meditation practice. Okay, the koan work is saying I can have an intrapersonal dialogue with myself whenever strong feelings arise. Right? That's giving me the sign that I can begin to have a mondo with myself. Right? The mondo with myself is an opportunity to use this ability for me to actually sit with and be not blind to what my organism's telling me. But ultimately, I can still drop into the emptiness because I have that skill, and that's a good way to complete the process. Okay, so we start to learn about ourselves, and we use these emotional koans as we continue to grow through our life, becoming more mature and becoming more understanding how these feelings are going to function for us. Okay, so I think ultimately Jun Po developed a technology that got us started, and now it's our job to sort of take it to the next level and begin to apply it in a more embodied manner in some way or another, which is what I'm suggesting. This is sort of the mini version of it. But it is giving you a taste of what it looks like to apply it in a more embodied manner. There's still a few more nuances with how it actually works. And therefore, we will truly get the information, and then we'll be able to understand ourselves and therefore show up for other people more effectively using our wisdom. So I'm going to read one little Jun Po quote. With training and practice, you can transform your negative emotional reactions. They are choice points where you can consciously choose to respond instead of habitually react. To recognize a choice point, we must practice concentration meditation. We must develop the ability to be present in clarity, part mind. We can then understand our emotional reactivity. We can choose a conscious response. Developing this capacity is the embodiment of true compassion. So he's pointing the way for us to not only have compassion arise through our meditation, but arise through our learning to recognize how we respond to the environment and how we respond to each other, and then practice. So I'm going to pause my talk from this particular moment in time.
Shining bright lotus.